The air in the Allstate Arena was thick, suffocating under the weight of a rain that had gone on far too long. It was January 2026, and the landscape of the women's division had calcified into a monument of arrogance. In the center of the ring stood the champion, a figure who had spent the last 18 months dismantling every hero the crowd had left to believe in. She didn't just beat them, she erased them. She held the microphone like a weapon, her voice cutting through the murmurs of a Chicago crowd that had long since lost the energy to boo. They were just tired. The apathy was palpable, a heavy blanket of resignation that settled over the thousands in attendance. There were no chants, no rallies, just the droning sound of a victory lap that felt endless. The champion spoke of a new era and a cleansed history, deliberately omitting the names of the women who paved the road she now walked on. She leaned against the ropes, her smile sharp and predatory, mocking the very idea of a savior. She listed the legends she had retired, the upstarts she had buried, and then she paused, daring the audience to conjure a name she hadn't already destroyed. The silence that followed was painful. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of a void. The commentary team, usually quick to fill the dead air with manufactured excitement, sat in somber agreement. They spoke in hushed tones about the dominance we were witnessing, acknowledging that there was simply no one left. The roster was depleted, the locker room broken, and the fans had stopped looking at the entrance ramp because they knew nothing was coming. The champion laughed, a shrill sound that echoed off the rafters, declared herself the eternal main event. She claimed that the past was dead, that the man was a myth people told themselves to feel better about their mediocrity. It was a direct provocation, a blasphemy against the memory of the one superstar who had defined the generation prior. But even that provocation failed to ignite a spark. The crowd didn't pop, they didn't riot. They just sat there, witnessing the final nail being hammered into the coffin of the resistance. The energy in the building was dangerously low, bordering on hostile indifference. It felt less like a wrestling show and more like a funeral for hope. Security lined the barricades, not because they expected a fan to jump, but because the tension in the room was so strange, so unnatural that anything felt possible. The lights in the arena seemed to dim, not by production design, but by the sheer collective mood of 20,000 people giving up at the same time. The champion raised her title, the gold gleaming under the harsh spotlight, and prepared to leave, satisfied that she had finally killed the spirit of the audience. The show was effectively over. The story was done. There was nothing left to fight for, and the stillness in the arena confirmed it. It was a perfect, terrible vacuum, waiting for something to rush in and fill it, or for the entire structure to collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. Then the feed cut. It wasn't a blackout, nor was it the dramatic pyrotechnics typical of a high-profile return. It was a jagged, ugly tear in the production that sent the Titantron into a spasm of static. The audio system let out a low, vibrating hum that wasn't music, but a frequency that made teeth ache. The champion in the ring froze, her arrogant smile faltering for the first time as she looked toward the production area, assuming a technical failure. Crowds stirred, the low murmur turning into a rustle of confusion. They weren't cheering yet. They were unsettled. The hum grew louder, shaking the floorboards, vibrating through the chests of everyone in the front row. It felt dangerous, like a machine malfunctioning before an explosion. The screens went black, plunging the arena into total darkness, save for the thousands of cell phone lights that flickered on like fireflies in a graveyard. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the dark and that growing, uncomfortable sound. Then, a single, distorted guitar riff scratched through the speakers, slowed down, warped, barely recognizable. It was the skeleton of a familiar anthem, stripped of its energy and replaced with dread. A single spotlight snapped on at the top of the stage, revealing a silhouette that looked wrong. It wasn't the triumphant hero they remembered. The figure was clad in heavy dark leather, head bowed, standing perfectly still. There was no steam, no pyro, no strut. When the figure finally looked up, the face on the giant screen caused the air to leave the room. It was Becky Lynch, but she looked haunted. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with dark makeup that looked like war paint applied in a frenzy. Her hair was a chaotic tangle of fire and shadow. She didn't pose. She didn't open her arms to the crowd. She just stared at the ring with an intensity that terrified the commentary team. "Is that?" one of them whispered, forgetting to use their broadcast voice. The crowd didn't explode in joy, they gasped. It was a collective intake of breath, a sound of shock rather than celebration. This wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning. She began to walk. The pace was slow, predatory, devoid of the swagger that had once defined the man. She moved like a storm front, inevitable and destructive. The music remained a low, grinding loop of distortion, refusing to give the audience the release of a beat drop. As she passed the barricades, fans reached out, but they didn't cheer. They watched her with wide eyes, sensing that the person walking down the ramp was not the same person who had left 2 years ago. There was a coldness radiating from her, a palpable aura of bitterness and accumulated rage. She didn't acknowledge a single fan. Gaze was locked on the champion, unblinking, unyielding. The atmosphere shifted from boredom to high-alert anxiety. This wasn't the fun, plucky underdog returning to save the day. This felt like an invasion. The champion in the ring, usually so composed, looked genuinely rattled, backing up against the turnbuckles as if sensing a physical threat rather than a competitive challenger. Becky climbed the steel steps, every movement deliberate and heavy. She wiped her boots on the apron, not as a ritual, but as a sign of disrespect. She entered the ring through the ropes, bringing with her a silence so profound that you could hear the leather of her jacket creak as she straightened up. The distortion in the audio cut out abruptly, leaving the two women alone in a dead silent arena, staring at each other across the canvas. The ring felt smaller than it ever had before. Becky stood in the center, motionless, her chest heaving slightly. Not from exertion, but from a contained fury that seemed to vibrate off her skin. The champion, usually the aggressor, found herself paralyzed by the sheer weight of Lynch's presence. There was no referee to separate them, no bell to signal the start of a contest. This was raw, unscripted tension that bypassed the logic of a wrestling match and tapped into something primal. The crowd was paralyzed, caught between the desire to chant Becky and the fear that cheering might break the spell of this volatile moment. Becky didn't reach for a microphone. The champion, trying to regain her composure, raised her title belt, shouting something off mic that looked like a demand for respect. Becky didn't blink, just took one step forward, violating the personal space of the title holder. The champion flinched. That single micro-movement, the flinch of a tyrant, sent a shockwave through the audience. They realized in that second that the hierarchy had already crumbled. Becky reached out not to strike, but to slowly, almost gently, lower the title belt from the champion's face. It was a mother disciplining a child, a master dismissing a novice. Then came the violence. It wasn't a wrestling move. It was a tackle, ugly and desperate. Becky drove the champion into the corner, unleashing a flurry of strikes that looked less like worked punches and more like a street fight. The commentary team screamed for security, their voices cracking with genuine alarm. "She's not here to wrestle. She's here to hurt her," one announcer yelled. The champion tried to cover up, tried to fight back, but the ferocity was overwhelming. Becky tossed her across the ring with a guttural scream that echoed through the silent arena without the aid of a microphone. It was the sound of 2 years of frustration being exercised in real time. Security guards flooded the ring, a sea of black shirts trying to pull Lynch away. She didn't just resist, she tore through them. She tossed a grown man through the ropes, kicked another in the gut, her eyes wild and unfocused. It took 5 of them to finally restrain her, pinning her against the turnbuckle. Even then, she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the champion, who was crawling up the ramp, clutching her title, mascara running, eyes wide with terror. Becky stopped struggling for a moment, and a strange, terrifying smile crept across her face. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who had just burned their own house down and enjoyed the heat. The crowd finally found their voice, but it wasn't the rhythmic chanting of a catchphrase. It was a roar of chaotic noise, half cheer, half confusion. They were witnessing a character transformation so severe it felt like a psychological break. Becky shoved the guards off her, straightened her jacket, and stood in the center of the ring. She looked down at the canvas, then up at the hard cam. She didn't wink. She didn't wave. She just mouthed 2 words that the camera picked up perfectly, sending a chill down the spine of everyone watching at home. "My world." She turned and left the ring, exiting through the crowd rather than the ramp, disappearing into the sea of people like a ghost returning to the fog, leaving the arena in a state of absolute electrified shock. The backstage area, was a hive of panicked motion. Usually, the camera cuts away to commercials or breathless replays, but tonight, the broadcast stayed live, following the chaos. The camera operator ran to keep up, the image shaking as it moved through the gorilla position. WWE officials were screaming into headsets, producers were scrambling to clear the hallways, and the other wrestlers usually seen watching monitors with practiced intrigue looked genuinely unsettled. This wasn't the standard shocked locker room shot, this was confusion. Faces like Seth Rollins and other veterans were shown briefly, not in character, but with expressions of concern, blurring the lines between the script and reality. In the medical room, the champion was shown throwing a water bottle against the wall, screaming about unsafe working environments. It was a masterclass in selling the fear. She wasn't plotting revenge, she was demanding suspension. This grounded the segment, making Becky's return feel like a legitimate, unsanctioned attack rather than a scheduled bout. The narrative was clear. Becky Lynch hadn't been cleared to return, she had broken in. The general manager was shown power walking down the corridor, shouting at security for a breach of protocol, adding layers of bureaucratic realism to the physical chaos that had just unfolded. Social media began to bleed onto the screen in chirons, showcasing the real-time reaction of the world. Did that just happen? Becky looks terrifying, legit scared for the champ. The blurred lines of kayfabe were being exploited perfectly. The narrative focus shifted to the locker room leader, a veteran babyface who was interviewed mid-hallway. They didn't cut a promo. They just shook their head. "I don't know who that was out there," they said, breathless. "That wasn't the woman I traveled the roads with. It was something else." It reinforced the idea that the time away had changed Lynch fundamentally, stripping away the polish and leaving only raw nerve endings. We cut to the parking lot, the lighting harsh and grainy. Becky was already there, ignoring the pleas of a backstage interviewer who was chasing her down. She didn't stop to explain her actions. She didn't offer a soundbite for the highlight reel. She threw her bag into the trunk of a rental car with a heavy thud. The camera zoomed in on her face as she paused by the driver's door. For a split second, the mask slipped. The rage faded, replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. She looked at her hands, trembling slightly, then clenched them into fists. It was a moment of human vulnerability amidst the monster she had portrayed in the ring. She got in the car and slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the concrete garage. The tires screeched as she sped off, leaving the cameraman standing alone in the exhaust fumes. The show didn't cut back to the announcers for a recap. It lingered on the empty parking spot. Silence returned, heavy and unresolved. The message was clear. The man had come around, but she hadn't come back to play the game. She'd come back to end it. The backstage segment ended not with a resolution, but with a question that hung over the entire broadcast. What happens when the hero returns and realizes they no longer care about being the hero? The screen faded to black, but the show didn't end. A video package began to play, but it wasn't the high-octane montage typical of WWE production. It was quiet, cinematic, shot in black and white. It showed empty wrestling rings, empty locker rooms, and the lonely highways that connect the towns. A voiceover began, not from a commentator, but from Becky herself. The audio quality was intimate, like a voice note recorded in the middle of the night. She spoke about the cost of legacy, spoke about the addiction of the spotlight and the silence of the home that waits for you when the cheering stops. "They ask you where you go when the lights go out," she whispered, the images on the screen shifting to slow-motion shots of her bruises. Her scars, the moments of pain the cameras usually cut away from, they think you go home to rest. But you don't. You go home to haunt yourself. The monologue was a deconstruction of her entire career. It wasn't about titles or WrestleMania moments. It was about the identity crisis of a warrior without a war. It revealed that her return wasn't born out of triumph, but out of necessity. She couldn't exist in the normal world. She was a creature of the canvas, doomed to return to the only place that made sense, even if it destroyed her. The video cut to shots of her daughter, obscured and fleeing, juxtaposed with shots of her holding championship belts. The contrast was heartbreaking. "I tried to be Rebecca," she said, her voice cracking. "But the world only wants the man, and if you starve a monster long enough, it doesn't die. It just gets hungry." It framed her return not as a happy occasion, but as a tragedy. She was back because she had failed to be anything else. She was back because the violence was the only language she still spoke fluently. The final shot of the video was Becky sitting alone in an empty arena, staring at the empty seats. The camera slowly zoomed in on her eyes, which looked ancient and tired. "I'm not back to save the division," she said, her gaze piercing through the lens. "I'm back to remind you all that this business takes everything." The screen cut to black abruptly, leaving the viewer with a feeling of heaviness. There was no copyright logo, no upbeat outro music, just the dark screen and the lingering echo of her final words. This wasn't just a wrestling return. It was a character study of obsession. It forced the audience to question their own complicity in the machine. We cheer for them to destroy their bodies for our entertainment, and then we wonder why they come back broken. Becky Lynch's 2026 return wasn't designed to sell t-shirts. It was designed to break hearts. It left the viewers staring at their screen, unable to click away, haunted by the realization that the hero they missed had returned as a ghost, and we were the ones who summoned her. The story had just begun, but the happy ending was already dead.